So, this is Emma and Nadine here, and welcome to episode 2 of the Allies podcast. In this episode, we'll be covering the basis of different gender identities and their involvement in society.
This is a short summary for those who are interested in finding out a little more about people who are in a similar situation and trying to find out who they are. Keep in mind that we obviously aren't experts in the field, and we ourselves are learning just as our audience is.
So, I've heard a lot about gender and how it's looked at like a spectrum, since there's a lot of in-betweens and details in how someone defines themselves, and there's also circumstances where someone's gender differentiates from their sex. So, Nadine, in case our audience is wondering, what is the difference between sex and gender?
I'm glad you asked. Sex is basically a person's biological attributes, how their genetic factors are made up to determine what they look like. Gender is how someone defines themselves based on what society says, based on the characteristics they have. Someone could have an opposing sex and constructed gender. Now that we know some of the differences between sex and gender, Emma, do you think you can explain some different gender identities?
Well, Nadine, remember how I said a lot of people see gender as a spectrum?
Yeah.
It usually ranges from masculinity to femininity. Someone can identify as anything in between on one specific side or just feeling comfortable moving around the spectrum. So we can't give a solid definition on what masculinity and femininity means since they're still being heavily debated. But of course, it just depends on the individual. So that's why those terms are often used to help non binary people describe themselves, since there are no real gender implications to them. There are a lot of different gender identities and ways people can express themselves. People can be what you might call gender queer, non binary, or even gender fluid. All are pretty interchangeable terms and can be used as umbrella terms for each other, but it just depends on the individual's preference again.
So I'm guessing that means those are the genders that are outside the spectrum, like you said before.
Right. People who identify as this way typically don't use the spectrum to define themselves.
Is that why people put they, them in their bios? Because she, her is usually used for those on the feminine side of the spectrum and he, him for those on the masculine side?
Yes, that's definitely a way for one to express their identity. In fact, have you ever heard of preferred gender pronouns? They're basically the pronoun or set pronouns that like someone would like to be called or addressed as in correlation to their identity or lack thereof.
Are you also familiar with the term cross dressing?
Not really. It sounds pretty complicated.
That's because the concept of it is actually pretty complicated. Cross dressing is a term that defines when one wears clothes that aren't commonly associated with their sex. Gender also plays a part because a lot of people see cross dressing as a form of gender expression. However, there are debates on whether clothes have gender, like the outrage on Harry Styles wearing a dress on the cover of Vogue, with dresses often being associated with the female sex or femininity. Some call it unmasculine, and some argue back, saying that clothes don't have a gender.
So, do clothes have a gender they pertain to?
That's for our audience to decide and to form their own opinion. Objects in general do not have a gender. Objects in general not having a gender is a progressive idea for society, but there is a lot of controversy around the idea, so there is no real answer to this question. I've also heard the term gender dysphoria being used. Mind elaborating on what that is?
So, gender dysphoria is basically the psychological distress a person can feel when they're uncomfortable with their assigned sex. But this has been treated as like a condition. Again, we can't elaborate too much on this with no medical expertise, but for some people, it's a part of trying to be comfortable in their own skin.
Ah, I see. But people haven't always been so accepting to the idea of a gender spectrum.
That reminds me, Nadine, can you elaborate on gender involvement and prejudice in society?
Gender prejudices have actually been in society for a super long time, far past the 20th century, but that would be a lot of material to cover. Instead, we'll start in the past, but not so long ago, when people would be arrested for dressing in drag. Drag is essentially the act of dressing in gendered clothing and adopting gendered behaviors as a part of a performance.
Wait, really? Being arrested? That's kind of intense for dressing just according to expression.
It really was intense back then when there weren't a lot of people back then who accepted these types of things. There have been steps forward, but there is still a lot of controversy and hate towards people who are just trying to express themselves in their gender identity. They usually get this kind of hate because it's not what society deems as normal yet. Though hopefully one day we can learn to accept people for who they are and how they express themselves. In 1983, a person named Rusty Brown told the San Francisco Lesbian and Gay History Project that I have been arrested in New York far more times than I have fingers and toes because she was wearing pants and a shirt. She states that you had to have 3 pairs of female attire in order to avoid being arrested for cross dressing.
Wow. I know we aren't nearly as intense nowadays, and everyone seems to be a lot more accepting. Like, people can wear a shirt and pants whenever, wherever. But, like, the Harry Styles situation, there are still very traditional ideas on the topic. And there's also the fact that transgender people can still be refused many services simply for their orientation, while inclusion has progressed a lot in the last decade. These things are mostly still happening since there are laws in the world, in certain countries that deny people rights based on their gender expression, identity, or sexual orientation.
Wow, that is true.
Although there's still a lot of information to learn about according to different gender identities, expressions, and discrimination, we hope that you at least learned a little bit from this episode about gender.
Stay tuned for our next episode about race and culture, featuring Sophia and Shakira.